probably don't use PowerPoint, right? You might, but, huh?
Everything's okay, no problem.
Yeah, it's up to you, it's your choice, but it's not required. Okay? Any other questions about that? We're good? Okay. So let's start to go. So please remember you need to bring this because I need to mark. You can hold on to it. No, keep it for now.
But I've written some words.
Oh, that's okay. That's all right.
You keep the score for yourself.
No, this is my notes.
That's okay. You should make notes of it, actually. Maybe I'll make my notes on something else.
So mine is done because they didn't listen to me.
Well,
I did.
well, because what I wanted to do was I wanted to make the notes here and then give it back to you, right? So you can see. That's usually how we use rubrics, right? So the instructor will fill it out and then give it to the students so they can see, oh, where did I make mistakes? So we make notes, right? Like, oh yeah, your logic was good, but this one point I didn't follow, or those materials were really nice, but maybe you could have taken some more time. They weren't, quite as well prepared as they should have been. Okay? All right, so let's start and go through chapter 5 then. Ooh, we've got 45 minutes, and we go through it a little bit quickly, I think. Yeah, so transition. Transition to what? What do you think this chapter means? What's the transition period? From L1 to L2, exactly. So, in this chapter, they talk a lot about L1, about first language acquisition, and about children. So why did we start with that? Why did we talk about L1? How is that helpful?
We talk about now.
Study language is so easy and someone actually learn
Because children learn easily? Okay.
It's similar to negative transfer and positive transfer.
Could be. Yeah. Other idea?
The influence of the point at once or everyone.
Okay. Yeah, it could be. There's another more easy, there's a simpler view. Why would you be worried about L1? We're talking about language acquisition, right? So where do we start?
We start talking about how children learn L1 so that we can apply the stages or the steps that learner can learn the second language.
Yeah, everybody learns their first language, right? If you're a healthy baby and you're exposed to language, you will learn that language, right? Everybody learns it. So everybody acquires spoken language. And so now we're talking about second language. Not everybody learns a second language, only if you're exposed to it or you study it for some reason, right? But everybody learns their first language. So what we're doing is looking at language in general. How do people learn language, right? So let's start with their first language. How do they learn their first language? So even before we start talking about positive or negative transfer, L1, L2, this kind of movement, let's just look at language acquisition. So let's look at first language acquisition. How does that occur? And then maybe later we can make some parallels and make some connections between L1 and L2. So what are the stages in first language acquisition? Do you know the stages? What is it? Babbling is the first one, right? Where babies go ba 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 ba, right? And then they'll say one word, 2 words, multiple words, and then there's a phase that they go through that's called telegraphic speech, right? So they have the 1-word phase or the 2-word phase, right? And then they go to what's called telegraphic stage, where it sounds like a telegram, right? So they leave out some important words, or just they only use the important words. They haven't learned like prepositions and articles and things like that yet. And then later, finally, they get to the multi-word stage. So can you draw a parallel here? Is this the same in second language acquisition, do people start with babbling? No, we hope not, right? But
I think when we learn, for example, I don't know anything about English, right? And I went to school to study, to do some actually study one word. So I just say, this kind of method.
it's really hard at the very beginning.
And, a teacher, she can say a lot, and Korean song assisted and things. So when we consider that as babbling,
Oh, well, so in babbling, they're just saying syllables. They're not saying words. You know, so how babies, they always start with ba, 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 or, you know, they're just making sound. Or they say ma, 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 right? No coincidence that in many, many languages around the world, the word for mother is like mama, mater, madre, you know, because the baby is babbling and the mommy goes, oh, she said mama, right? Baby has no clue, they're just making sounds, right? Their system is developing, right? Like when they're young babies, their mouth changes shape, right? The tongue is a muscle. They start to get control over that muscle, just like their arms and their legs. At first they flail, right? And then they can learn how to grasp something. Same thing with their tongue. They can learn how to use it to make sounds. So this is kind of like the warm-up, right? So beginner students in SLA, they don't babble because, yeah, they skip that stage, right? Because they wouldn't just be saying the same syllable over and over again, right? It might be very difficult to pronounce. It might be very hard to say the word. Maybe they can repeat a song and not know what it means, but it's still not babbling, because babbling is just a syllable, right? So you say over and over again. And then they don't really do a one-word phase either, right? Where, like babies, they'll say mama or daddy or something like that, dada, right? They start with that. They might do that for several weeks before they can say another word. So usually people in SLA don't do that either, right? So in fact, the process for SLA is quite different from first language acquisition when we're babies.
Excuse me, what is the CV pattern?
CV are consonant vowels, so like BA for baba, right, or MA, mama, right? Yeah. So they repeat that over and over again. Any other questions here? So I was going to show you a video. I don't know if we have time. This is really interesting. Do you know Jeannie's case? Yeah? Really terrible situation, right? Tell me her story. What was the story?
She was abused by her parents.
In the house. Was isolated in the 30 years?
6 years.
No, deep.
13.
13 years.
So the child couldn't speak.
She looked like a 6-year-old girl.
There's a girl named Jeannie, a little girl, and this would actually happened in California. I think it was in the 1960s or late 50s. And she was abused. Her parents kept her tied to a potty chair. So she could go to the bathroom in the potty chair, you know, but she was tied to a chair the whole day. They didn't interact with her. They didn't talk to her. I don't know what they would do, just like go in and change the potty chair and give her food or something. So they kept her alive. They fed her, but they didn't interact with her at all. So she had no exposure to language. So as we were saying, any healthy baby who is exposed to language acquires the language. They all learn it, unless, for example, they're deaf or they have maybe a cleft palate. They might have difficulty in speech. But otherwise, if they're healthy, they learn it. So this was a very, very unusual case because we almost never have a child who hasn't been exposed to language. It almost never occurs. So this was a very, very rare situation where this child was kept until she was 13, and she was found by some authorities, and the parents were prosecuted for child abuse. But what was interesting for psychologists at the time, unfortunately, right? I mean, the poor little girl, she becomes a curiosity. She never really acquired her L1 like a native speaker. So she did learn speech, but it was always kind of stuck at the telegraphic stage. She didn't go beyond that. And they believe this is where the theory of the critical period arose. So what's the critical period hypothesis? Do you know that?
There are certain times that the child can learn the language for the best result. So
Yeah.
Time.
And when is that period? Anybody know? So
3 to 6 years old.
no, it's a little older than that.
5 to 10.
The critical period is related to puberty. So when the child becomes an adolescent,
13?
yeah, about 13, it's different for different people. Different people enter into puberty at different age. So it might be like this period between 12 and 15. And at that time, it seems that something happens in our brain where the brain changes and it becomes what we call less plastic. And this is the reason that we think children are such good language learners, because they absorb things so easily. They learn about everything easily, right? About social interactions and sharing and songs and all kinds of things. Because their brain is still developing and growing, right? The neurons are still making connections and they're growing at a very, very rapid pace. So this is why they learn so quickly. So at puberty, our brain starts to slow down in development. And so they found with Jeannie that if the child is older than puberty, they'll never learn their first language like a native speaker. And so we can transfer this to second language acquisition, in that if you learn a second language after puberty, there's one area that never becomes exactly like a native speaker. What is that?
Pronunciation.
Pronunciation. Adults can learn everything just like children. We can learn all the vocabulary, we can learn all the grammar, we can learn everything, but pronunciation is very, very rare. It can occur, but it's very, very rare to have somebody who learns a second language after puberty and have perfect pronunciation. So this is the critical period. So critical period, it's a period. It's not one specific day or one specific age. It depends on the person and when they go through puberty. But when you go, and puberty is a phase too, right? It's not like you wake up the next day and suddenly you're an adult, right? So it's a couple of years, right? So the thing is, if you start second language acquisition before you have completed puberty, then you have a better chance of learning the second language with better pronunciation, right?
Could you please say that again? Before the puberty
It's finished, before it's finished. So if you start learning your second language before you have completed puberty, then you have a better chance of acquiring that second language more like a native speaker. It's not a guarantee. It doesn't mean just because you started before puberty, you will become like a native speaker. It depends on how long you study, how motivated you are, do you study a lot, right? Because like if you just study the language for 1 year, then you'll forget it and you won't progress very much, right? But you have a better chance, you have a better opportunity of acquiring all of the skills, including pronunciation, if you continue to see it through.
So suppose that you should start learning some language before
Yeah, so that's,
young.
exactly. So we need to be careful though. Does that mean then that you should start learning a second language as young as possible? Yeah, not really. So there is like an outer limit. You should start before puberty if you can. If you can't, it doesn't mean that you shouldn't study it either, right? You're just not going to have perfect pronunciation. That's fine. We can live with that. That's no big deal, right? But in terms of how, there's two different ways that you can learn a second language. There's parallel bilingualism. That's when you're exposed to more than one language at the same time. So children that are growing up in a family where maybe the mother speaks one language and the father speaks another language, they're exposed to both languages, so they learn both languages at the same time. That's one situation. Usually when we're talking about SLA, we're talking about sequential bilingualism. So you learn one language and then you start learning another, right? That's usually the case. Because usually with parallel bilingualism, we don't really worry about it so much. Because the child is being exposed to both languages, it's like they're learning both of them as their L1. It's not like one is an L1 and one is an L2. You might have one that's more dominant than the other, and that will play out over the years. Like eventually, maybe they will come to prefer one language over another. And that usually depends on the environment that they're in. What kind of school do they go to? What language is spoken at that school? What language is spoken in that community? So that usually influences what eventually happens with the bilingualism. But when we're talking about SLA, we're usually talking about sequential bilingualism. So the child first learns one language and then starts to learn another. So in our case, we're concerned about learning English as the second language. So what do you think would be the best age to start learning another language as a child in sequential order? You guys think, do you think as early as possible is good? Do you think it's really good to put like 3-year-olds in English class here in Vietnam?
This is good, but a lot of parents aren't.
A lot of parents do it, right? Is it a good idea?
What about the age of 8 or 9?
8 or 9? What's the problem?
It's the prize. The prize. You
Yeah,
want the child to be the best
right.
in the class. So they push the children into the class, no matter what they can do.
So there's a lot of factors that push parents to have their children start to study as soon as possible. So they think that, and usually parents are not good consumers of research. They don't know how to read this stuff, and they don't spend the time to do it, right? So they go by advertising, right? Yeah, they're not critical thinkers. They listen to that advertisement, oh, get your child, get them ahead of the game, right? They'll get into the best schools and the best universities and get the best job and blah, 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 right? And so they're proud, right? And they want their child to be the best. And of course, they only want the best for their child. Their heart is in the right place. They're trying to do something good for them, right? But maybe they're pushing them too soon or too fast. So why did you say about the age of 8 or 9? Why do you think that that's good?
Oh, Mark.
Yeah.
Because as you say, the best time to find the L2 as a native speaker is between the age of 3 and 12.
No.
Okay, so be careful.
Puberty,
Hang on. I just want to be really careful about this because there's always some kind of confusion. It's not that the best period is during the critical period. It's any time before, up until the completion of puberty. So the best time to learn a second language is any time before you complete puberty, not just in that critical period. The critical period is like if you don't start by then you'll probably have difficulty with pronunciation.
Just only the pronunciation.
Only pronunciation. Yeah.
So, and adding to the fact that you say you shouldn't put the children to school too early. So I think between the puberty and not too early, so guessing as well. Just taking a guess.
Okay.
These are the A&I.
Okay. Any other ideas?
I think it's above 6.
Yeah. Why do you think that?
Because before that, the child is forming at L1. If we have L2, they may have some overlap, and the children may have difficulty in pronunciation in both languages.
Exactly. Yeah. This is my opinion, is that they should be well solidified in their L1 before they start to learn in L2. Unless it's going to be parallel bilingualism that's done at home. Because it's not parallel bilingualism if they go to class for 1 hour a day or 1 hour a week or something. That's not the same as being exposed to both languages simultaneously. There is some exposure, but it needs to be about 50-50 for it to actually be parallel bilingualism. So, in fact, it's best if children are more solidified in their L1 before they start learning in L2. So I think in general, like about 6 is a good age. And there are a couple of issues with that though too. Just like at the beginning when we drew the Venn diagram with all the different circles, there's so many variables that influence that. So is it the parents that are pushing the kids? And then, yeah, there's psychology, right? So are the kids going to then become averse to learning English because their parents are pushing them so much? What? That happens, doesn't it?
Yeah, some students in my class, they're about 8-year-old. Learning English is like a responsibility from the parents that gives to them. They don't feel like learning it.
Yeah, it becomes a burden, right?
Yeah.
But there is another situation. My neighbor, they are of course French, and they send their child, the first kid to the international school. So the child, that boy stays in the school from 7 a.m. to maybe 6 p.m. and he speaks English most of the time, of course. And when he returns home, after 1 year, he feels more confident speaking English because he was only 6 years old in the first grade, so he could acquire language very quickly and he feels very confident. And then when he talks to me, he loves it because he can express his idea very straight. And then after 2 years, his mom had to take a Vietnamese teacher to teach him Vietnamese in the evening.
Sure.
Right, because whenever he wants to, when he's angry, he always speaks English. So English maybe become his first language maybe at that time. Yeah. His mother tongue is Vietnamese, but at that age, you're right, he couldn't pick very much, many sentences, long sentences, so he cannot express his ideas fully in Vietnamese. So when he's angry, he speaks English 100%. Alright, so his mom was so scared and she had to have a teacher to teach him Vietnamese in Vietnam.
That's funny. Wow.
Alright, so for the second child, she got some experience, so she sent him to the international school anymore, right?
Yeah.
And she just let the child study English as the extra subject on Sunday and
Like
Saturday.
foreign language.
Yeah, how interesting. Yeah.
Okay.
We do experiments with our children, right? We don't know, we try, oh that didn't work, I'll try a different approach with
But
this
the
child.
first child was so clever and he could pick up the language very quickly. And he speaks very natively. Right, his language was so native.
Interesting. That's great. So as I was saying, there are lots of different factors that influence this, and wealth is one of them, right? So when parents are wealthy, they want the best for their children, and they can offer the best. So they offer the best schools. They want them to get into the best universities. If the parents are from a lower socioeconomic status, they're not concerned about university when the child is 5 years old, right? So there are all different kinds of factors that come into it. I think one of the other most important factors is that when we send very young children to English class, usually those teachers are not very well qualified. Usually they don't really care. Like usually administrations choose anybody who can speak English. That's good enough. And so they don't know anything about methodology, they don't have a master's, they pay them very little. So you can't be assured that your child is getting the best type of education. Sometimes they have no idea what they're doing. And sometimes their English isn't very good. honestly, right? It's a little bit better than the 5-year-olds, right? Honestly, you know, so we need to be careful. Sometimes we want to do the best for our kids and we want to push them, but parents need to be really good consumers, right? They need to be careful about what they're doing with their kids' lives and how they're spending their time and their money. But yeah, so about 5 or 6 is about the ideal age because they've become more solidified in their L1. And how do you know what somebody's L1 is? Like in this situation that she described where this kid, when he would get angry, he would speak in English. How do you know, how do you determine? So like in this situation, how does he know? Yeah, he learned Vietnamese first when he was at home as a baby, but then English became predominant, right? There's a couple of things that kind of indicate what your L1 is. And that's one of them, is what language do you speak when you get angry? What else? What language do you speak when you... Yeah, when you love somebody, absolutely. When you express emotion, right? When your deepest emotions, because as you said, you can speak very straight, very clear. It expresses your feelings, right? So you have an emotional attachment to your L1. So when you're afraid, right, that's what comes out. That's why so many pilots have accidents. Because sometimes, right, the international language of communication for pilots is English. Can you imagine your plane's going down and you have to speak in English and all you can think is in your native language? Oh my God, we're going to die! You have to be calm enough to be able to speak in another language, right? So they say when you're any kind of emotional situation, when you're angry, when you love, when you're afraid. Also, what language do you use to pray in? When you speak to God, or when you pray, yeah. So that's usually in your L1 because of the same affective factors, right? It's emotion, it's this deep, deep connection. So when you want to speak the truth, the real, real truth, you usually do it in your L1. And the other one is what language do you use to do calculations? Can you do math in your head in English? Let's see, raise the 4 times 7, right? Right? So that's a good indicator of what somebody's L1 is. So Jeannie was the person who gave rise to the critical period hypothesis. Because of her case, we were able to see that if a child is not exposed to a language before puberty, that they'll never acquire it like a native speaker.
But do you think it's too soon to make a conclusion like that, just based on one case?
Well, the problem is that it's so rare that, you know, there are very, very few cases where this has ever occurred. This was in the 1950s, and this is the case that we still cite, right?
Until now, right?
Yeah, until now.
Somebody needs to step up to sacrifice.
We could try again. There are some cases of children that were raised in the jungle or something like that, you know, like by wolves, and they drank the milk of wolves. Sometimes it's more myth than reality or something, but exactly. So it's very, very rare, but yes. When we're doing research, you need a certain number of observations in order to draw a conclusion. Based on this one observation, this is the conclusion that we have. So good critical thinking. Maybe we should be skeptical. We don't know. Maybe she had other problems. She was abused, right? So there's other psychological things going on for sure. Absolutely. Very good point. Okay, so then we start to talk about something called the morpheme order studies. Do you remember this? What's that? So now we're getting into the 70s, right? We're moving more into the modern era. And this is also with first language acquisition, okay? So what they observe is that children, when they're learning their first language, they tend to learn the morphemes in this order. So very first, children learn present progressive. I'm eating, right? I'm drinking. They don't learn simple present, right? They learn present progressive. So it's kind of interesting. So what we're trying to do here is make a parallel with SLA. So does that mean when we're teaching people a second language, should we follow the same order? Is it more natural? Would it make more sense to us if we studied present progressive first and then simple present later? So this is a theory, perhaps. I don't know, there's some theories. I've never seen like evidence to show. It's kind of hard to restrict to the variables, and a person only gets present progressive and they can see how they acquire the language. But this is one theory, right, that we should follow the same order that we follow in first language acquisition. So after present progressive, they start to get two prepositions, in and on, and then they get the plural S. And then, isn't this interesting? They get the past irregular way before the regular past. And what do we usually teach first? We always teach regular, right? We teach the rule and then the exceptions to the rule. But isn't that interesting that the children learn the exceptions first, and then they learn the rule, right? So perhaps we can make the case that we should teach our students the irregular verbs first. Doesn't seem very logical, right? It seems more complicated, but naturally this is the way people acquire it. And then later, look, the verb to be in step 6. Isn't that the first thing we teach?
No.
Right? No? No? It usually comes like at the beginning though, right? Of learning a language. So this is the morpheme order studies. And this also, so you made a great point about like when you have just one observation. This also was done with, I think, this theorist, Brown, he observed 3 children. And he observed them learning language, and this was the order that he found. So, I don't know how well it...
What is the last one?
Irregular third person, simple present.
Yeah.
So like,
Last one.
I do, he does.
an R, right?
And he eats.
Huh? So, simple present.
Yeah, I am. He eats.
I go, he goes,
No, this
she
is
goes.
simple present.
He goes, he does.
About number 9. 9, 10, and 6.
So 9 is the regular, is simple present, where we add, add S, right? To the third person singular, right? And then this would be the irregular one, like go, do, right? You add ES instead of just S.
So, I mean, have, has.
Has, yeah, exactly.
So this is the best order to know.
Well, this is one proposition, right? This is the way that people learn their first language in English. This is the order of the morphemes that children learn when they're learning English. So if we're trying to make the case that we think that SLA should be similar to first language acquisition, we can make the case that this would be the best order in which to teach the words. However, now we're usually talking about people who are older. How old are you when you learn your first language?
First.
Where's the second?
One.
Your first language.
First.
1 year, right? Most healthy children start speaking by the time they're 12 months old. They'll have 1 word or so, right? 12, 14 months. Some a little bit younger. So usually we're talking about people who are much older than this, right? So can we make the parallel? Is it the same as a child acquiring morphemes in their first language when we want to teach an adult or an adolescent a second language? So they're 2 totally different cases, right? So, but it's food for thought, right? It's food for thought. Maybe it would be the best order. There are some methods that follow this order. The, gosh, what's the name of the method? What's the name of the method where you repeat after the audiolingualism? The audiolingual method follows this order. So there was a method in the 1970s that said, okay, so let's try it. If this is the way people learn their first language, let's teach second language like that. So audiolingualism was kind of a combination of behaviorism and morpheme order studies. So they use a lot of repetition, repeating the same forms, but they would repeat them in this order. So this would be the order that they would teach him. So then now we get to Krashen, and that's the monitor model, right? So Krashen was in 1982, and his monitor model is kind of complex. It has 5 different theories to it in this model. And so the first theory is acquisition versus learning. So can you guys tell me what's the difference?
So, concepts first and learning is
Okay, yeah. Acquisition is natural, right? You learn by being exposed to the language. Whereas learning is more of a conscious process. You're studying. You usually go to class to learn something. You usually have a teacher. So acquisition is more natural. It's like when you go to visit another place and you acquire the language in that place. So you're acquiring it from the environment. Usually, in fact, what people do is there's a combination of things. So let's say, for example, if I were to come live here in Vietnam, I would learn by being exposed to the language, but I would also study it, right? I would get a grammar book or take some classes or something. So I would study it at the same time. But that's the distinction. And so what Krashen said was that they're very different psychologically in your mind. That learning can never become fluent and natural like acquisition. They said if you learn it in a book, you're never going to speak naturally as you do when you acquire a language. Do you think that's true?
I agree totally.
Do you? Yeah? Oh, from your experience? Yeah. So there's some people that agree, there are some people who disagree. They say, no, not at all. I studied in a book and I speak very fluently. I've studied in a class. Right? So there's different opinions on this. This is one part of his theory. And then the other one was the natural order, which we just saw, the same thing, right? So he also talked about that. That was Brown's study that was done before, and he believed that there was a natural order of acquisition.
So the morpheme,
The morpheme order studies, same thing as natural order hypothesis. Yeah. It's Krashen took that idea from Brown and incorporated it into his theory of the monitor model. And then the next part is the monitor hypothesis. Can you tell me about that? Do you know what that is?
The knowledge you have already learned, use it to check. Every time you use it, to make sure that you use it correctly.
Okay.
So, for example, whenever I say something, you check out who I say it first, and I can start to produce speech.
Okay. What do you want to add to that?
Learning is something that you learn in the classroom. So there's some rules of language. About acquisition is something that you learn outside classroom through communication. And learning will help you perfect in developing the language.
Okay. All right, so that's back to learning and acquisition, right? But I was asking about monitor. So
Learning will help to check acquisition.
oh, okay. All right. So your learning can become kind of like a monitor over your acquisition. So when you acquire a language, you speak kind of naturally. But when you learn something, you learn the grammar. And so the monitor is kind of like that voice in your head, you know, that says, oh, no, that's wrong. That's not right. You know how you have the little devil and the little angel sitting on your shoulders, right? Who's talking in your ear. So that's the monitor. Like, oh, no, you made a mistake. That's wrong. You shouldn't say that. Like, oh, yeah, good job. You got that word right. Right? So do you think that this helps your production or interferes with your production? What do you think?
Once I tried to correct my student when he was speaking, he just that only pause to speak.
Yeah, exactly. It stops your fluency, right? So have you ever had this experience where you're speaking in another language and you're speaking and you think to yourself, oh man, I'm speaking so well. Darn, and then you lose it, right? And you can't speak anymore. This is when your monitor becomes conscious. So it kind of interferes.
It's a self-monitor, right?
It is.
Monitor ourselves, but the case you mentioned is you corrected it. It's not
That's a good point. Yeah, so she was monitoring her student. Usually, according to Krashen, he's talking about inside your own mind, monitoring yourself. But she made a parallel to the classroom, same situation.
I think it works in my case, like for example, I didn't find a language to have a chance to go overseas. And then I just speak then I think without thinking. And when I actually become a teacher and review about the rules and stuff like that, I start to pay attention about what I'm saying. And suddenly I realized that my speech became much slower than before. So it's kind of one.
Yeah, exactly. So you described an interesting process where you went back and forth. So you study the language, you learn the language, you learn it academically in class, and then you go abroad and then you start to acquire it because you're exposed to it like a native, and then you come back and you're speaking in here and you start to monitor your speech because you learn it at a different level when you come back and teach, right? It's one thing to learn the language for your own use, but then when you need to teach it, you need to learn more about grammar and theory and how to explain it. So then you start to monitor yourself. So that's really interesting, good description of all of these processes. So in general, what Krashen says is that the monitor does interfere. It kind of stops your fluency. It keeps you more accurate, but it's that voice in your head that kind of stops you from speaking, from being fluent. And then he talks about the input hypothesis. So his input hypothesis is that you need to be at this level of I plus 1. So it's input plus just a little step above where you are right now. If you're a beginner student and somebody gives you this textbook to read, right, you're a beginner student, this is your input, how much of it are you going to understand? Nothing, right? But if you're a master student and you read this textbook, how much are you going to understand? Nothing. You should understand a lot more because it's just one step above where you are right now, right? If it's 2 or 3 steps above where you are, then it's going to be more difficult, right? If the language is very difficult, if the grammar is very difficult, if the concepts are difficult, less of it gets in. It can only be a certain amount of distance away from where you are right now. So this is the input hypothesis. That in order for anything that you are exposed to get into your mind, it can only be a little bit above where you are right now. This is very similar to the ideas of Vygotsky. Do you know him? Have you heard of him, a Russian theorist? He's a very interesting guy, really interesting guy. So he was alive and publishing in the 30s, but because of the situation in Russia at that time, the information didn't get out to the West until much later. We only found out about his ideas in the 70s. And so then we started to cite Vygotsky and read his work and learn about it. And he was a social-cultural theorist. So he looked at the influence of society and culture on learning and language acquisition. It's really very interesting. So he would say something like, for example, like you learn the word axe, you know, an axe to chop wood. But just learning that word is not just that word. You learn all of the representations together with that object. So you think about your grandfather who would go out to the woods and chop wood and bring wood home, and then grandmother would cook dinner with that wood. So all learning is a social phenomenon. We learn this word because somebody in history made this object that we can use as a tool. And then people down through the generations use this tool in a certain way. So this information has so many layers of meaning. It's not just acts, this, oh yeah, this thing that you used to chop wood. It has all of these associations with it. So that's just one example, right? That for him, learning is a social, historical, psychological phenomenon. So he had this theory called the zone of proximal development. That's what ZPD is. Have you heard of this before?
Yeah.
Yeah? So what he would say is that, let's say that the child is at this stage, right? And they want to learn something new. So it's kind of similar to Krashen's idea of input plus one.
Yeah.
And so what Vygotsky said in this CPD is that with mediation, with help from somebody, from a teacher or a tool, an object that was created by society, then you're able to learn this information. So somebody can help you to get to this level. And then this becomes your new level, right? So now you're covering this full level. And then your new zone of proximal development will move out to here. So if you